5, 6, 7, 8.
Hi everyone, welcome to the EX Podcast episode number 9. My name is Stefan Vincent. I've started this podcast because I believe that companies have to think of themselves as employment brands if they hope to attract and retain talent. Let me ask you a simple question. Are you excited to get up every day and go to work? What about your employees? Well, consider this. Only 30% of the workforce feel engaged at work. That means for the other 70%, well, work kind of sucks. And yes, we all get it. Engaged employees are good for business. But why companies are not acting on it? After all, employees are the first ambassadors of a brand. Engaged employees foster innovation, deliver higher customer service, and bring creativity to the organization. In other words, they are more productive. This podcast brings a different lens to the employee experience, a brand and customer experience angle, rather than a traditional HR angle. In our episodes, we cover multiple topics that touch and impact the employee experience, like the key components of a positive employee experience, or office space design and its impact on the company's culture, the employee journey map, or how design thinking, collaboration, and innovation are intertwined. We also talk about employer branding and employee engagement tools and measurements, or the place of technology in the employee experience. Today's guest is Kristian Andersen, partner at KA+A. KA+A is a venture studio which conceives, launches, and scales next-generation enterprise cloud companies through the application of business strategy, world-class design, and product development. Today, we'll talk about how KA+A differs from traditional venture firms and what type of talents they're looking to attract to fulfill their mission. How, in Kristian's opinion, a business brand and an employer brand are intimately intertwined. We will also discuss that there is no specific framework or process to build a successful startup culture. It all depends on the CEO's leadership ability and personality. And how startup CEOs manage business versus culture priorities. This episode is brought to you by Mold, M-O-L-D. Mold is a full-service brand agency that works with artists, writers, and creatives to help its clients increase sales, book more gigs, and boost audience engagement. Its creative team of graphic designers, videographers, writers, and brand managers work together to make sure that every time a client's name is seen or heard, it shines. Find out more at themoldagency.com. I hope you enjoy this conversation. If you get a chance, please make sure to review the podcast on iTunes. You can open the iTunes app and type in Stefan Vincent or EX Podcast, and you will find us there. And last thing, if you want to send me feedback, suggestions for future topics or guests, you can reach me at svincent@exsummit.com or on Twitter at ex_summit. All right, let's get to it. Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of EX Podcast. Very excited for today's guest, Kristian Andersen, partner at KA+A. Kristian is a designer at heart. He started Studio Science, a design and digital branding agency, and co-founded multiple startups. Kristian, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
Tell me a bit more about KA+A and what your role is within the organization.
Sure. KA+A is, well, first of all, nobody thinks their own kid is ugly, so bear with me as I describe this. But sure. KA+A is really a new model for entrepreneurship. It marries kind of an emergent business model that's commonly referred to as a startup studio with a venture fund. So we call it a venture studio, pretty clever of us. And it's really basically a glorified design firm with a venture fund bolted onto the side of it. So I'm a partner there along with 3 other of my co-founders, and we have a team of about 21 folks, designers, strategists, engineers, finance, talent, et cetera, et cetera. And we're 2 years into the experiment, and the goal is to launch 10 net new software companies in a 4-year period of time. And we are off. We've been doing it for 2 years. We are off to the races. And, as I like to say, check back with me in a few years, and I'll tell you how successful we were. But so far, so good. It's really kind of a dream job for me.
How is it different from other venture firms or startup incubators?
Yeah.
What's the difference with High Alpha?
Yeah, there's two primary distinctions. I'll start with the traditional venture model comparison. A traditional venture fund, of course, is some smart folks that have raised money from limited partners and that are pursuing returns in a very narrowly defined asset class of venture. So they're chasing great entrepreneurs with great ideas who are building great businesses and hoping to invest in those businesses. A venture studio works kind of like that, but in reverse, right? So what we did was decided what would happen if we raised all the money up front and then began to work on where are the great entrepreneurs and what are the great ideas. So, having co-founded a couple of software companies historically, I can tell you the way it normally works as an entrepreneur. You come up with what you think is a terrific idea. Yeah. You talk about it a lot. You walk around that idea for many months, in some cases years. You then get the courage to begin working on it. You build a little bit of product. You try to go sell a little bit of that to customers. You start to break things, and maybe you hire 1 or 2 people to help shore that up, and then you go, wow, we're going to run out of money next week. We probably should go raise some dough, and you go spend 90 days, 100 days trying to, scrape together $500,000 or $1 million, and it's really quite debilitating. The fundraising process can really force an entrepreneur to take their eye off really what they should be thinking about every day, which is how do I make great product? How do I sell great product, and how do I serve my customers? So what we did at High Alpha, and this is the big distinction, is we basically said, we're going to go start a bunch of companies, but instead of starting them and then figuring out how we're going to fund them, what if we solve for that first? Okay. Here's how we're going to fund them, and now we're going to go build them. So again, the traditional venture fund is looking externally for ideas and businesses to fund. Venture Studio is focused on developing and launching companies internally.
Okay. What are some of the companies that High Alpha has launched over the past couple of years?
Sure. Well, first of all, anyone who's interested, you can check us out at highAlpha.com. But let's see, I'll start with kind of the most recent and move backwards. Yeah. We've launched a really neat legal tech startup called Doxley, which is streamlining the transaction management process. A company called Xylo, which this is a really neat company co-founded by a wonderful entrepreneur named Eric Christopher that's helping big businesses get a handle on their spend and utilization of cloud software. And that sounds really boring, but it's a really, really big problem. I can tell you, running a little studio on my own, I'm no longer involved in the day-to-day operations, but one of the ways that I try to stay connected is as I review the credit card statement every month. And late last year, I was going through the credit card statement, and I noticed, wow, we have over 30 recurring charges for software hitting that credit card every month. And this is a little 30-person design firm, right? I thought, man, that is a lot. As I dug deeper into it, I found that 4 of those were project management software. So we're paying on a monthly basis for 4 separate project management software products. Yeah. And I dig a little deeper, and what I find out is we're only using one of them, right? But because it's so easy now for anyone to swipe a credit card and become a customer of a software company, and there's so many great things about that. But one of the dark sides of that used to be if you had a 1,000-person company, you might have 3 or 4 people in procurement that made decisions. Today, if you have a 1,000-person company, you have 1,000 people in procurement. Yep. Anyone with a corporate card. So those are 2 recent examples. We're focused really exclusively on building software products that are deployed through the cloud in a subscription model that are exclusively focused on other businesses. So what used to be called B2B SaaS, today some people call it enterprise cloud. So we're very tight on that focus, but in terms of the industry, we're in marketing, sales, HR, educational technology, finance, legal. So we're really no respecter of industry. We'll go into any industry, but the dynamics that have to be present for us to get really interested is it's got to be a product that's sold to other businesses, delivered over the internet, and generates revenue in a recurring fashion.
On the previous episode, we had actually Max Yoder.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Which lessonly is one of your babies at High Alpha, right?
Yes.
So as a designer and a brand strategist, you obviously value the importance of a business brand, whether a B2C customer-focused brand or a B2B brand. How is a company's business brand related or connected with the employees or the employer brand?
Yeah. Well, as you undoubtedly know, over the last few years, we've seen the rise of this term they call employer branding, which is really a kind of clever way of talking about how to galvanize your workforce to help you with recruiting. It's employer branding has largely focused on recruiting. But there is this kind of emergent space, obviously, that you're very passionate about, that relates to employee experience. And increasingly what we see, whether you're in professional services, technology, or even manufacturing, even kind of an old line business, what you're seeing leaders recognize is that the people are our product. Right? Now, everyone's paid lip service to that for a very long time, right? The people make the difference, and so on and so forth. Yet the irony is, employers know largely, the way I like to think about it is the guy that I buy my air filters from online probably knows more about me than my old employers knew about me, right? I mean, we actually know very little about the people we work with and work for. And I don't mean are they a Colts fan or a Packers fan, but in terms of what are their hopes and ambitions, what are their expectations, what is their own kind of personal development plan, and how would that impact what the business is doing and how they're deploying resources. I mean, we're infinitely complex individuals. And therefore, there's an opportunity for businesses to pay a lot more attention to who their employees are. And I think this is important for some obvious reasons, things like attrition. Again, we tend to want to glom on just to the HR business case when we think about crafting transcendent employee experiences. And certainly that's true. Great employee experience is going to create a context where recruiting is easier, where you don't struggle with attrition as much. But it transcends that in a big, big way. Arguably, if you're delivering great employee experiences, those employees are going to be producing far better products. So a colleague said to me the other day, people worry about attrition, like unhappy employees leaving. A far bigger issue is an unhappy employee staying, right? I mean, that's if they leave, that you take that loss at a point in time and then move on. But if they stay, things can get really bad for all parties concerned. And one of the easiest ways to kind of mitigate that is to create terrific employee experiences. And they're not always the same. As a matter of fact, they're almost never the same. The French have this expression terroir, which I'm not French, nor do I speak it, but if I understand it correctly, it has to do with the characteristics of the earth. So that a grape seed planted, in the Bordeaux region is going to taste different than that very same grape planted in, Oregon. Right? And in the same way, every company has a very unique and different terroir. And you could you could plant the same person in different companies, and they're going to mature and impact that culture in profoundly different ways. So, I don't know. I get very kind of frustrated when people talk about what's the best way to kind of clone a culture that's working somewhere else, because quite frankly, you just can't do it. Every business is, at the risk of sounding like a total cornball, is a unique little snowflake, right? They are all very different, very individual.
So Nathan, who now leads the day-to-day operations at Studio Science, talked last fall at the first EX Indie Summit on how to use design thinking to foster a culture of innovation and collaboration within a company. What's your take on this? Obviously, innovation is a big part of high alpha. So going back to the employee experience, but keeping people here, or sorry, those who perform well, how do you create and maintain a culture around innovation, and what's the place of design thinking in that process?
Yeah. We're like an extreme case of this, right? Because if you think about like what our day job is, it is a very extreme version of innovation. So where a typical employee is going to work in a business for many years, probably just focused on kind of one primary thrust product, or at a minimum just thinking about that individual business and what innovation looks like in the context of one business. The people I work with are thinking about what does innovation look like in the context of a dozen businesses as a current state, and then are constantly, if you think about what our core product is, it's two things. It's developing new business concepts and launching them, and then supporting the growth of existing businesses, right? So at any given time, we're thinking about 10, 11, 12 different sets of business challenges concurrently. So we are never at risk of not being in a place where we're being called upon to innovate. We're never at risk of being in a scenario where we're not being encouraged or resourced to pursue that. As a matter of fact, our risk is basically an over-inundation of that calling, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
So one of the things we're really intentional about here is how do we focus on an individual's ability to actually decouple from that mandate and how they get their batteries recharged. We spend a lot of time trying to understand who people are as individuals. We use a tool called Predictive Index. Did Max talk about this when you interviewed him by any chance?
No.
Okay, because Max is also a huge devotee of this. But, there's dozens and dozens of these kind of personality tests and performance-oriented measures. I love this one. It's like short. It's kind of abbreviated to PI, but it's referred to as Predictive Index. And one of the things that it allows you to do is just understand how to relate to your coworker and what does your coworker need. As you know, an extrovert is someone that actually recharges their batteries by being around other people, right? So when this person is at rock bottom, is fatigued and tired and spent, the best thing for that person is to go sing karaoke with all of their friends, right? On the flip side of that coin, if you have an extrovert, it's the exact opposite. When that person is completely spent, the best thing that he or she can do is go off and be by themselves. So when we think about how do you build a culture that kind of creates the context for creativity, innovation, there's not like 10 rules to that. Ultimately, it comes down to knowing at a really kind of a deep, a rich, and an intimate level who those people are on the team and what their specific kind of needs and aspirations are. And it's a lot. It sounds kind of squishy. It sounds kind of maybe even too touchy-feely. But it's had a huge impact on our business. We actually have a product on our mobile phones that allows me to pull up anyone I'm about to walk into a meeting with, and I can real quickly see their personality profile. Where do they index on the introversion extroversion scale? Are they a high dominant person, or are they a little more passive, and so on and so forth? I can scroll through and see, oh my goodness, this is a Red Sox fan, and the Red Sox won last night. So I know they're extroverted, I know they love sports, and I know they love the Red Sox. I'm going to be able to connect with this person in a very kind of real, intimate. Now, granted, we're using technology to help make that happen, but that doesn't make it any less sincere. So anyway, in short, I get a little worried when people talk about, well, the way we use design thinking to foster innovation is we have a big bucket of dry erase markers and Post-it notes and bean bags, and we have a coffee clutch hour at 8 a.m., because those are all just kind of expressions of a healthy innovation culture. None of those things are inputs. None of them. To me, again, it has to do with knowing who your coworkers are and creating a space where they can do their very best work.
Does it take a specific framework to allow that employee experience and collaboration, or is it a very processed system that you have to put in place? Do you have more freedom without a sort of defined but very broad framework, or is it very process oriented?
Well, I think it probably depends on the stage of the company.
Right.
So I won't even say depends on the company. I'll say depends on the stage. So, if you're a 20,000 person multinational, the answer is probably very, very different than if it's three folks locked in their grandmother's basement trying to, work on the next big thing to put a dent in the universe. My whole life is spent with very early stage companies. And in those very early stage companies, the process is incredibly informal. It's almost always a reflection. When it's done well, it is a reflection of a healthy leadership team, what their particular kind of preferences are. Some are quite rigorous and try to engineer a level of kind of process and this isn't bad. I've seen this work as well. But, it always strikes me as a little funny when you have a 15-person company with 5 separate committees around, entertainment and fun and things that oftentimes you would see in a much, much larger organization where you have to divide and conquer. Doesn't mean it's bad, right? By the same token, I know companies that have hundreds of employees that have almost no formalized structure around. And I'll just talk about culture for a minute, but around culture, it just is. And you can feel it, and it's good, and it's positive, and it drives outcomes. So again, I think it has a lot to do with the management style of the leadership team, but maybe even more importantly, kind of the stage and the scale of the business.
Okay, so that leads me to a question. Obviously, in a startup, there are a lot of conflicting priorities. Getting funding, as we discussed earlier, getting MVP at the door, finding beta customers, paying customers. At what time should a CEO focus on the culture? Or does it happen organically, or is there a process around it?
Yeah. Stefan, I'm trying to avoid using a platitude here because I think this is such an important question. It's such a good question to ask. I don't know of any companies that have been able to sustain high levels of success over long periods of time that had bad culture. I don't. I mean, now you might say, well, what about Exxon? They're kind of an evil oil company. No, I mean, that may be one person's or a group of people's perspective on kind of the morality of fossil fuels. But if you look at the culture of that organization over time, it's a healthy, high-performance culture. The flip side of that is there are a number, I don't know when this episode's going to air, but there's one in particular, very high-profile tech company located in the Bay Area that is beginning to show some real stress fractures, almost all of which could have been avoided if you had taken it all the way back to the bedrock of the culture. Okay? And again, it's a 4-letter word.
Yeah. Starting with a U.
Starts with a U. Yeah, exactly. Okay? So you look at so many, and by the way, they've done many wonderful things as well, but if you look at the things that they're struggling with in the public eye, what was it? Was it a technical flaw in their product? No. Was it a flaw in their pricing and packaging or their go-to-market strategy? No. It was fundamentally a cultural flaw, right? And one of the reasons I feel sorry for them is these cultural flaws were the same things that were being celebrated early on in their rise, right? This is a take no prisoners, go for it, win at all cost culture. And a lot of people on the sidelines, clapping, right? It was only when it began to manifest itself in darker ways that we were able to kind of see, wow, this thing is cultural. So it is of paramount importance. I do not think they can be engineered. Culture can be engineered. I think culture is, it has to develop organically, but it can be done with intent. It can be guided. You can prioritize the amount of time and energy you spend thinking about the inputs for culture. Again, I don't think you can design a culture. I think what you can do is you can identify collectively what's important to us. as human beings? What are we not going to compromise on? What will we value above all else? What are the set of criteria we will use in order to automatically make decisions for the business? And I'd love to just give you an example. And this goes back to nobody thinks their own kid is ugly. But at High Alpha, we have 3 core values, and we established these core values on day one. Now, we did not design a culture on day one. We did not come up with clever names for committees, and we don't have a signature cocktail. And I don't think anyone has yet kind of wrapped their car with the company's logo. And, maybe those things will come with time. But what we do have is a very brief, very succinct set of values. And they are dream big, expect more, and move fast. Okay? Now, I think in the wrong hands, those could just be vacuous, useless platitudes.
Yeah.
But when applied rigorously, they actually create culture. Right? When applied rigorously, and if you'll notice, if you think about those 3 things, they're actually in conflict with one another. So they're values that coexist, but they don't coexist in some kind of utopian construct. If I say expect more, I'm talking about I expect more out of myself, I expect more out of my coworkers, I expect more out of the products we build, but that lives right next to move fast. Mm-hmm. Well, hold on a second. How am I going to move? Am I prioritizing moving fast, or am I prioritizing expecting more? And dream big, what happens when you throw that into the mix? So I think one of the things that's really important is a small set of deeply held beliefs that exist almost uneasily with each other in many cases, right? Because that forces you to prioritize decision making. And so when we're talking about, are we going to hire this person? Are we going to add this person to our team, right? One of the things we're thinking about is, well, we need that person yesterday, right? And we should move fast on this. And somebody else is like, yeah, but I'm not sure. I think they might be an A-, not an A+. And we owe it to ourselves to expect more of our new colleague, right? And so on and so forth. So, and I don't know that particular process works for everybody. I can tell you that I've used it with several companies. And as a place to start, the kind of foundation of culture, I think it's that. I think it's a small set of succinct, commonly held values that you can rigorously apply to all the decisions that the company is going to make.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier that the culture cannot be engineered, right? And on the episode we had with Max Yoder, and we had another one actually with Jeb Banner as well, and both talked about the fact that those
are both 2 people who I hold in very high esteem when it comes to matters of culture. So.
And that's great because they had actually a similar point of view in the fact that it's very similar to software development. You're going to put something together, test it, get feedback, iterate it, test it again, and so forth and so forth. So there's no, as you said earlier, you cannot engineer the culture. You just experiment a few things here and there, see what works, what doesn't work, and make changes.
Yeah, I will. Okay, so I will, and I agree with that. I will add kind of just a layer of nuance to that, which is, I think culture can emerge. I think there's basically 2 primary fonts of culture, and one is this highly collaborative culture building exercise where you get a group of folks together, everyone has a voice, maybe some are louder than others, but everyone kind of has a voice, and you're moving toward this definition of culture together, right? And that can be very powerful. That can be very powerful. There is another type though that I don't think is necessarily better or worse, but it's real, and that is where you have one very strong voice driving culture from day one, and he or she is bringing everyone else along, right? It's less of a cooperative culture and more of an evangelistic culture, right? Where in the cooperative one, we're all getting together and figuring out who do we want to be when we grow up? What would that look like? There's another one. You see this with cult of personality. I mean, these are I get so frustrated when people reference Apple or Steve Jobs in these types of interviews, but just, for the sake of argument here, or we can talk about Travis Kalanick, we can talk about Richard Branson, we can talk about Steve Jobs or Larry Ellison or Bill Gates. Those cultures, although certainly heavily influenced and modified, specifically in later years by very accomplished management teams and coworkers, we're set and we're defined.
Right.
We're chiseled in the bedrock and driven largely by one person's kind of indomitable drive. And oftentimes it wasn't that they were setting out to build a culture. They were setting out to accomplish a goal, and as a function of setting out to accomplish that goal, a culture emerged. So, to kind of Jeb and Max's point, I think a very healthy, and I think you see it more and more today, as the kind of the millennial and the Z generation are demanding kind of bigger voices in the enterprises they attach themselves to. You're going to see more of this cooperative culture building, but do not discount the power of one deeply convicted person to shape big, durable, important cultures really kind of on their own. Because I think the annals of business history are full of lots of folks that have done that. And again, I'm sure lots of other people's contributions are kind of minimized in those narratives. But depending on the nature of the organization, consensus can on occasion be the enemy of a great culture, as opposed to being the catalyst for a great culture.
Yeah, it's a very good point. I'm intrigued by one question I have for you. So at High Alpha, you've launched multiple startups. Do you replicate some of the culture elements in other companies, or can you somehow standardize culture with some of those elements? Especially when we involve in multiple companies at the same time.
I really don't. That has not been our experience thus far. So to say that one can't do that would be a stretch. I think that these companies are familial, and as a result of being familial, you'll notice that sometimes, like, your sister will have, pick up some of your facial tics, but your sister is a unique individual, very, very different person, but oftentimes will have, expressions or worldviews that mirror mom and dad's or brother, the brother. So there are familial characteristics in the business. I think they're probably less cultural than they are kind of practical processes. So there are things that we've learned how to do well that can be replicated and exported. So there is a playbook for building a sales team, right? But I would stop short of saying that playbook for building a sales team is a kind of predefined unit of culture that we're replicating across these businesses. My experience has been more the opposite, which each one of these companies are so different and are reflections of their individual leadership. And that's what makes them special, because every industry is different, every team you build is different, every problem they're seeking to solve is different. And if we took a rote set of processes, cultural processes, I think it would become very clear to all concerned kind of how inauthentic that. I just don't think it'd work. And again, authenticity is kind of an overused word when we're talking about soft things like culture. But it matters. If you have an inauthentic culture, if you have, a Stepford Wives culture, people aren't attracted to that. People don't want to be a part of that. People don't want to sacrifice for that. And listen, if you want to build a successful startup, you better build something that people want to be a part of, and you better build something that people are willing to sacrifice for, to suffer for, or you're not going to be very successful.
When you bring a CEO on board for a new startup, do you look at obviously you look at their previous experience, right? Do you pay attention to what type of culture they worked in, what type of culture they implemented in the leadership role before coming to one of your high alpha startups?
Well, Yeah, I guess historically all of our CEOs have come from some form of leadership role, although in many cases, I mean, you look at Max. Max is a great example. I mean, Max was a very young man when he joined Lessonly as CEO. I don't think you would disagree with this. He did not have a lot of leadership experience, and he did not have a lot of experience building big cultures.
That's what he said, yeah.
But it was clear with Max, Max, I first got to know Max when he applied for an internship at Studio Science. That was our first foray. So he went from kind of intern to CEO in a very short period of time. But it was clear to me that he was going to build the right type of culture, because I had seen him build other movements and galvanize teams and individuals to fight. He's a leader. He got people to follow him, and he definitely is a lead with your heart kind of person, as opposed to kind of lead with your head, although he's building that muscle as well. So, a lot of what we do, VCs like to talk about pattern recognition, which is like, I'm going to see a lot of something, and as a result of seeing lots and lots of that something, I'm able to kind of extract valuable signal from that. I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
So when I interview entrepreneurs for the first time, or I'm getting to know entrepreneurs for the first time, I'll ask a battery of very similar questions. One of them is, hey, tell me about the first time you remember making money on your own, which might sound like a vulgar question, but Jason Fried says lots of things I agree with. But one thing I love is he talks about how entrepreneurship is about business, and business is about making money, and the way you get at making money is by practicing making money. It's like everything else in life. You want to get good at something, you got to practice it, and entrepreneurship is no different. And what you'll find is a common thread amongst many of these entrepreneurs is they have this story about getting sent to the principal's office in third grade for selling candy on the playground, or making cinnamon toothpicks and selling them after school, or hopping the fence and running over to the 7-Eleven and buying lemon heads, or whatever the case might be. And you'll see this kind of entrepreneurial march with people who just have a history of starting stuff. Then they were mowing lawns in high school at the beginning of the summer, and by the end of the summer, they weren't mowing lawns, they were just hanging up flyers, and their 5 friends were mowing lawns for them. And then they get to high school, and they start a screen printing company. And you see this like cadence. And Max, and again, this story is very specific to Max, but Max had that. I asked these questions of Max, and one example was he didn't have they didn't have an advertising degree at Indiana University, which is where he attended.
Oh, yeah.
He wanted to graduate with a degree in advertising, so he just rolled his own. It had never been done before.
Yeah.
And he has lots of neat stories like that. So I guess my point is that there are patterns you can pick up on very, very quickly with leaders to determine, are these folks capable of building healthy cultures? And, like I said, VCs like to call it pattern recognition. I would just call it good old-fashioned intuition. And sometimes we get it wrong. You know what I mean? Sometimes we get it wrong. But I would argue, like, if there's one thing that we need to get right, it is assessing a leader's potential to build and sustain a healthy, winning culture. Because they can be the most brilliant engineer in the world. They can be the most charismatic salesperson in the world. If they cannot build and sustain culture over time through the ups and through the downs, if they cannot galvanize kind of the will of their coworkers over time, they're not going to be successful. They will fail. There's no question about it.
That's a very good point. So I know we're getting close to the end right now. Typically at this point in the podcast, I like to ask our guests sort of personal question, or something that they would like to share with the audience that the audience may not know that they do. Something that not necessarily a little secret, but something that people may not know about you.
Are you doing that now?
Yes, I'm doing this now.
Okay. Wow. I'm so loquacious. I just don't know if there's anything people don't know.
Let me ask you this one. What was the first product that you sold? Or your first venture?
Well,
before Studio Science.
Yeah, no, I love it. Well, okay, so I cheated a little bit when I was telling you my story of kind of entrepreneurs, kind of historic track records. The first thing that I ever sold was, I mentioned this earlier, was cinnamon toothpicks. So I would make cinnamon toothpicks in my mom's kitchen, which a cinnamon I'd buy this cinnamon oil at the drugstore, and I would soak toothpicks in that oil overnight. I was probably 8 or 9 years old, and then I would meticulously wrap them in sets of tin in foil. And of course, I was an aspiring designer, so I had little labels that I designed and hand, drew by hand and put on that. And then I marked them up liberally and started schlocking them on the playground in 3rd grade. And I got in trouble for it. That did get me a trip to the principal's office. So the first time I remember generating revenue of my own volition was 3rd grade. And I basically had a scheme every year after that. I joke a lot. I never worked for anybody. I never had a job. I never got a W-2, but I always had money because I was always kind of figuring out how to make something and sell it, or to buy something and mark it up and sell it. And I remember one year I had a lemonade stand. I lived in a very, very rural part of Arkansas. So my nearest neighbor was half a mile away, and God bless me and my sister, we set up a lemonade stand on some deserted rural road, in central Arkansas, and we sat there for 2 hours and nobody drove by. And this was disappointing and vexing. And so we ended up moving all of the lemonade we had in these beautiful little glass pitchers into igloos that we then bungee corded to the back of my 4-wheeler, and we decided to turn this into this might have been Arkansas's first food truck now that I think about it. And my sister would sit on the back of that 4-wheeler with that igloo cooler between her legs, and I drove door to door, and I became a door-to-door lemonade salesman. And I will tell you, that was far more effective than sitting on the side of the road and waiting for Farmer Brown to drive by.
Yeah, you've got to go to where the customers are.
We went exactly to where the customers were, and it was a very profitable endeavor.
Awesome. Well, I know you're a super busy guy, so I really thank you for your time today.
It's my pleasure, Stefan. It's rare that I get to sit down for an hour and think really intentionally about this kind of stuff. So much of it happens in between the cracks. It was a fun exercise, so thank you.
Just one last question. For our listeners who would like to follow yourself and High Alpha on social media, where can they find you?
Sure. We're on Twitter at High Alpha, HIGHALPHA. And you can find me at Kristian Indy, which is KRISTIANINDY.
All right. Thanks a lot, Kristian.
Thank you again, Stefan.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to the EX Podcast. If you want to learn more, you can visit our website at exsummits.com to find out when our next events are. You can also find my manifesto on business to employee or B2E branding at b2ebranding.co.